Wait until you hear the whole story. It's wilder than you'd ever imagine. That's the only warning I can offer before I delve into the day a woman, known only as HOA Karen, decided she had the power to tow my car, one she never realized was owned by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her attempt to flex the community bylaws turned into an absolute circus, complete with shady tow companies, stoic FBI agents, and a final twist so bizarre that my quiet cul-de-sac would never be the same. If you think suburban life is all manicured lawns and weekend barbecues, trust me, this story will flip that notion on its head. So buckle up, you won't want to miss a single detail. I've lived in the Glenwood Oaks subdivision for nearly 2 decades. When I first bought my house, it was a place of promise. Wide sidewalks for evening strolls, neighbors who waved from their porches, and kids who rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Over the years, things changed. Families moved out, a new wave of residents moved in, and that once close-knit feeling of community started to erode. A big part of that shift was the homeowners association. At first, the HOA was helpful. They maintained the entrance landscaping and sent out friendly reminders to keep trash cans in our garages. Gradually, their sense of authority ballooned. Minor requests turned into multi-page bulletins detailing how tall our grass must be, what color mulch we could use, and even the acceptable length of holiday lights. That's when Karen arrived on the scene. Although back then, nobody really called her Karen. Her real name was Darlene, but she embodied every trait of the HOA Karen stereotype, insistent on her own rules, critical about everybody else's property, and fiercely protective of her version of neighborhood standards. She quickly climbed the ranks of the HOA, and by the time this fiasco occurred, Darlene was in charge of compliance, a role tailor-made for someone who relished pointing out everyone's so-called violations. I tried to stay in her good graces, or at least stay off her radar. I kept my yard pristine, my mailbox painted, and my fence within code. Admittedly, it was a chore, but I figured it was worth maintaining a peaceful existence. Unfortunately, even my best efforts weren't enough once she turned her all-seeing eye to my driveway. What was her big issue, you might ask? My car, or, to be precise, the sleek black sedan that seemed to appear in my driveway one day without notice. I have a dear friend named Hector. We served together in the Air Force back in the day, and we've remained close ever since. Hector retired from the military and went on to join the FBI, eventually working in some highly sensitive divisions. When his schedule got hectic, he needed a place to store a bureau-issued vehicle temporarily while he was overseas. My home, nestled in a quiet suburb, seemed like the perfect solution. Hector entrusted the car to me, along with strict instructions to keep it under lock and key, away from prying eyes. Now, on the surface, the car didn't stand out. It looked like a standard sedan, typical government-issue black with tinted windows. It carried no obvious official markings, just a small government plate on the back. Unless you came close to read it, you'd never suspect it was property of the FBI. Of course, that didn't matter to Karen. She saw a mystery vehicle that was neither on the official list of registered cars for the neighborhood nor in my personal name. Technically, Glenwood Oaks had a rule about unregistered cars not being parked in driveways for extended periods. But that rule was meant for abandoned junkers with broken windows and missing license plates, not a well-maintained, validly plated car. I caught my first whiff of trouble one Saturday morning while trimming my shrubs. Karen, clad in neon pink sneakers and an HOA visor, came power-walking down the sidewalk with a notepad in hand. She paused in front of my driveway and just stood there, scribbling furiously. The look on her face spelled condemnation. Recognizing the signs, I waved politely and asked if there was a problem. She didn't wave back. Instead, she gave me that tight-lipped Karen glare. "What's the story with that sedan in your driveway?" she demanded. "Morning to you too, Karen," I greeted, attempting to inject some warmth. "That car belongs to a friend of mine. He's away for a bit, so I'm taking care of it for him." She narrowed her eyes, staring at the license plate as if she'd discovered some secret. "Well, it's not registered with the Glenwood Oaks database. You'll need to fill out the updated homeowner vehicle forms and pay the associated fee." "Fee? For a friend's car that was already legally registered with the state, her request felt more like a cash grab than a routine check. But Glenwood Oaks had complicated rules, and the HOA was empowered to enforce them. Disagreeing too publicly risked an avalanche of fines and warnings. Still, Hector had instructed me not to draw any special attention to the car, which I worried might happen if it appeared on the HOA's official vehicle registry. I tried to offer a compromise. Look, I'd be happy to share basic details with you, but the car is a government vehicle on legitimate business. I'm not sure that it requires an HOA registration. Karen's mouth practically formed an upside-down U. If it's a government vehicle, it certainly doesn't belong here. We're a private neighborhood, and we have the right to know exactly what's going on. This is for our safety. If you don't fill out the form, we'll have to take corrective action. Without another word, she marched off, leaving me simmering with a mix of confusion and anger. Corrective action, in HOA speak, usually meant fines, but occasionally it could mean towing, even for cars with valid plates. The woman rarely missed a chance to push her weight around. Little did she know, or even suspect, that messing with an FBI vehicle came with consequences on a whole different playing field. But at that moment, I had no idea how quickly she'd escalate. I planned to talk to Hector about the best way to proceed. Unfortunately, Karen beat me to the punch and forced our hands in the worst way imaginable. Within days, I found an official-looking HOA notice taped to my front door. The letter, typed on Glenwood Oaks letterhead, detailed the infraction of having a non-registered vehicle parked on property, along with the statement that I had 7 days to remove it or face towing at my expense. They included a breakdown of the costs, an initial towing fee, daily storage fees, and an ominous line about additional legal remedies. It was as if I tried to open an illegal junkyard rather than simply park a friend's well-maintained sedan. The ridiculous part was the claim that the car posed a security risk. We'd had 0 reports of break-ins or suspicious activity for years, but apparently, Karen was convinced this sedan was some threat to the neighborhood's peace. No mention, of course, of how the tinted window SUV in her own driveway was any different. I felt my blood pressure spike. Karen had power, I couldn't deny it. The HOA board members were either apathetic or too intimidated to challenge her. She'd clashed with other neighbors over trivialities before: a child's bike left on a lawn, a patriotic flag hung in the wrong spot, and a potted plant that didn't match the color scheme. Nobody dared push back because her vendettas had a nasty reputation. I heard stories of monthly fines stacking up, or neighbors forced to remove landscaping they'd just installed. I didn't want that fight, but I also couldn't comply with her demands. Hector's instructions were clear. Keep the car as inconspicuous as possible. The last thing the FBI wanted was to share official vehicle data with some meddling HOA. So I decided to call Hector, hoping I wasn't interrupting anything critical. Hector answered on the second ring, his voice hushed. I could hear a faint echo, as if he were in a secure facility. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern in his tone. I explained the situation, the HOA ultimatum, the threat of towing, and asked for his advice. He allowed a dry laugh. "You're kidding. They want to tow a federally owned car?" Tinted windows must have set off the local busybody's alarm. "Karen," I said. "That's what we call her. Karen, or Darlene. She's the local inquisitor general." Hector paused for a moment. "We can't put official plates on the HOA's record. That'd be a security breach. But I also don't want you stuck with a mountain of fines. Let me make some calls. Maybe we can get a local field office to store it temporarily." I exhaled relief, imagining a simple solution. "Sound good. If that's easier, I'm all for it." Hector promised to get back to me, and we hung up. I assumed it would just be a few days of waiting, and the car would be whisked away, with Karen left none the wiser. My only real concern was surviving that 7-day deadline. Things escalated faster than I'd planned. On day 2, I woke up to find another note on my door. This one was hand-scrawled on a slip of lined paper. 3 days left. If the car is still here, we're towing it. No signature, but the distinctive bubble letters at the bottom read, HOA compliance. I suspected Karen had strolled by herself to slap that on my door. It felt like something out of a bad crime novel, an intimidation tactic. At that point, I was worried. Hector hadn't called me back yet, and time was running out. The next morning, I found Karen standing at the end of my driveway again, snapping photos of the car with her phone. This time, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "You know this is harassment, right?" I said, stepping out onto my porch. "I'm working on a solution, but you're giving me virtually no time." "It's not harassment," she retorted. "It's enforcement of HOA bylaws, which you agreed to follow when you moved here. My job is to protect this community. I've been here for 20 years. I shot back, frustration creeping into my voice. "You've been here for, what, 3? Don't talk to me about protecting a community you barely know. That car is no threat to anyone." "You're not above the rules," she snapped, ignoring my glare as she continued her photo spree. 2 days left. Then I'm calling my tow guy, and you can fight it out in court. I felt my face burn, but it wasn't wise to argue further. She wanted a scene, maybe even an angry outburst she could record and play for the HOA board. So I turned on my heel and went inside, leaving her to finish her photo op. That night, I heard from Hector. He apologized for the delay. There'd been some hold up with the field office. "It's going to be another week at least," he said regretfully. "I know that's not ideal. I can come pick it up, but not until I'm back stateside. I'm caught up in an operation. Can't leave. Phone lines are monitored." "You're sure they'd really tow it?" "Positive," I answered. "This lady is gunning for me like I've personally offended her." He sighed. "Understood. Let me see what I can do on my end. If they do tow it, call me immediately. That truck driver won't know what he's gotten himself into." 2 days went by, like living in a pressure cooker. Every morning, I expected to see a tow truck parked outside, ready to haul the sedan away. But it never came. By the time day 7 arrived, deadline day, I almost relaxed, assuming Karen had decided it wasn't worth the fight. I was wrong. Very wrong. That evening, just as dusk settled, I heard the low rumble of a diesel engine outside. Looking out my window, I spotted a beat-up tow truck with a questionable paint job inching down the street, its headlights searching for an address. My heart sank. Instinct kicked in, and I rushed out to confront the driver. Sure enough, there was Karen, standing in the bed of the truck with some scruffy-looking man in a baseball cap. She wore a triumphant grin, shining a flashlight at the license plate. "This is the one," she proclaimed. "Hook it up." I tried to keep my voice even. I didn't get any official notice about this happening today. You can't just show up like a thief in the night and haul the car away. Karen's grin only broadened. "Oh, but I can. Check your mailbox. Your official notice arrived this morning." I realized it was a setup. They deliberately timed the letter's delivery for the same day they planned to come, ensuring I had no chance to call for help. My fury mixed with a jolt of anxiety. If that car got towed to some impound lot, the potential security breach would be massive. The driver jumped off the truck, hooking up chains to the sedan's front axle. My pleas fell on deaf ears. Karen stood, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered on her face. "Maybe next time you'll follow the rules," she taunted. That's when everything went off the rails, and I do mean everything. Chaos unleashed. A tow truck, a furious Karen, and an FBI surprise. My heart pounded so loudly I could scarcely hear the clang of metal as the tow driver latched onto the sedan. The very thought of letting them haul away an FBI vehicle, replete with restricted equipment hidden inside, was unthinkable. Knowing I had no time for phone calls or wrangling HOA bylaws, I did the only thing I could in the heat of the moment. I stepped in front of the tow truck. Yes, I physically stood there, arms spread, blocking it from moving forward. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. And probably not the smartest move, but I was running on pure adrenaline. The driver revved the engine, glancing uncertainly at Karen. She screamed at me to move out of the way. "This is private property," I shouted back. "You can't take this car." I bit my tongue before blurting, "It's FBI property," in front of the entire neighborhood. I didn't know how much I could or should reveal. Karen's flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating me in a harsh glare. "You're obstructing an authorized tow. If you don't move, I'll call the police." I hesitated, remembering Hector's advice. Call him immediately if they tow it. There was no time to do that discreetly. The truck driver revved the engine again, inching the truck forward. I really didn't want to be flattened over a vehicle, no matter how important. Out of nowhere, I heard a distant shout. One of my neighbors, a retired police officer named Richard, emerged from his house. He'd never been Karen's fan. He jogged over, his silhouette framed against the streetlight. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his authoritative voice honed from decades of law enforcement. Karen sneered. "This doesn't concern you, Rich. It's an HOA matter. We have the authority to tow this unregistered vehicle." Richard glared at her. "Authority under the HOA guidelines, perhaps. But if you're towing from private property without proper notice, or if this car is legally registered with the state, you're stepping outside that authority. And if you're threatening him, that's a separate issue." The tow driver began to look nervous. "Look, lady, do you or don't you have the permission to tow? I don't want any trouble with the law." Karen snatched the slip of paper from her pocket. "My so-called notice. It's all here, see? 7 days." He didn't comply. "We're within our rights." Richard grabbed the paper, his jaw setting in a hard line as he read. "This is questionable. The notice is dated yesterday. That's hardly the full 7 days. My neighbor's doubts spurred me to try once more. You'll be making a big mistake towing this car. There are federal implications." Karen rolled her eyes. "Federal implications? What are you? Some kind of secret agent? Save your excuses." She whipped around to the driver. "Take it now, or I'll find another tow company who will." The driver shrugged, hopped back into the truck, and eased forward, the chains rattling ominously. I had to make a split-second decision. Do I risk letting them tow it, or do I lay everything on the line? Then I recalled the license plate was obviously federal government issue, albeit subtle. Maybe that would force them a pause. I hopped onto the running board of the tow truck's passenger side, startling the driver. "Look at the plate," I shouted, pointing to the sedan's rear. "That's not a private vehicle. This is an official federal government car. You tow that, you might be committing a federal offense." The driver squinted through the window. Karen jerked her head around, focusing her flashlight. Sure enough, the plate's small U.S. government text was visible if you really looked. Her face twitched like she didn't believe it. She turned to me with an incredulous snort. "If it's some federal car, why wouldn't you say so earlier? You're just making that up." But the tow driver was rattled now. "Ma'am, you told me this was a personal vehicle. I can't tow federal property. The feds don't play around with that. I could lose my license, maybe even get arrested." I could see the cogs turning in Karen's mind, and pride was waging a war against common sense. She doubled down. "It's not. He's lying. That's probably a fake plate or something. Just do your job." Despite her bravado, the driver hesitated. Meanwhile, neighbors started congregating on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion and engine noise. It felt like half the block was gawking at the spectacle, flashlights bobbing, phones recording. I was certain this fiasco would go viral if the video hit social media. Sensing the tide turning, Karen began hurling insults at me in a desperate attempt to retain control. "This is typical of you, always thinking you're special. You probably bought some novelty plate online. I'll prove it's fake." She stomped over to the sedan, phone camera poised, ready to gather evidence. She crouched down, trying to get a clear shot of the plate. That's when the sedan's alarm system, a specialized FBI security measure, suddenly blared. The shrieking wail was so loud it rattled windows. Then, to everyone's shock, the car's headlights began flashing, and a stern, automated voice boomed. "Step away from the vehicle. Authorities have been notified." Silence fell over the crowd for just a split second before the alarm continued its piercing shriek. Karen nearly toppled over in surprise. The tow truck driver sprang back, eyes wide, hands raised as though surrendering. Richard pulled out his cell phone, but he paused, probably unsure whether the authorities were already on their way. Karen regained her composure enough to shriek back. "Someone turn that thing off." My ears. I didn't dare approach the car, uncertain whether I could disarm that specialized alarm system without input from Hector. But it sure got the job done. No one dared lay another finger on the sedan. Then, as if on cue, my cell phone buzzed. Caller ID. Hector. How he knew to call at that moment was beyond me. Perhaps the car's system automatically notified him. With the alarm screeching in the background, I had to duck behind a tree to hear. Yeah, I answered, nearly yelling. What in the blazes is happening? I got an urgent notification from the vehicle's security system. Are you okay? Hector's voice crackled with concern and frustration. It's a long story. Short version. An HOA maniac is trying to tow your car. The alarm went off. The driver's freaking out. I'm getting a location ping. Looks like local law enforcement will be dispatched automatically. Do not let them take the car under any circumstances. I'll give you official clearance to let the cops know this is a federally owned asset, and the only people authorized to move it are FBI or designated government personnel. I stared at the pandemonium unfolding in front of my lawn. They won't be able to tow it unless they want to do it under a screaming alarm and the watchful eyes of the entire neighborhood, and soon the local police. Hang on. Karen was now in full meltdown mode, shouting at the tow driver, at me, at the neighbors. The driver had enough. He unhooked the sedan, hopped into his cab, and cranked the engine. You're not paying me enough for this, lady, he hollered at Karen. I'm out of here. Karen whirled on him. You can't just leave me like this. That car is in violation. But the driver peeled off, dragging loose chains with a thunderous clank down the street. The spectacle ended almost as quickly as it began. The siren was still blaring, though, and Karen was seething with rage. Any composure she once had was gone. She jabbed a finger at me. You'll regret this. I'll get the board involved. I'll get a bigger tow company. I'll have your property seized for endangering the community. Her voice cracked, betraying her fear as the alarm's automated voice repeated its warning. Meanwhile, neighbors muttered among themselves. Some looked genuinely worried, but most wore expressions of disbelief and, dare I say, amusement. This was far beyond typical HOA drama. I could practically see them exchanging side glances, thinking, how do we end up in the middle of an FBI fiasco? Moments later, the sound of sirens rose in the distance. The real police were on their way. Karen realized it too. She darted off in the direction of her house, probably to concoct a story that didn't make her look like a lunatic. I glanced at Richard, who just shook his head. This is going to be a wild night, he muttered. He couldn't have been more right. Consequences and aftermath. When the FBI car towed Karen instead. The local police arrived in a pair of cruisers, lights dancing across the cul-de-sac. The blaring alarm from the sedan had subsided by then. Hector, remotely connected, managed to kill the siren just as the first cruiser rolled up. The abrupt silence felt just as jarring as the alarm had been. The lead officer stepped out, scanning the scene. I recognized him, Officer Mike Perez, a longtime fixture in our community. He took in the crowd of neighbors, the suspiciously angled sedan now free of tow cables, and me standing awkwardly on my lawn. Everything okay here? Officer Perez asked, though from the swirl of questions in his gaze, he was clearly uncertain what brand of chaos he'd just walked into. Richard, always quick on his feet, took the lead. We've had a bit of an incident with the HOA trying to tow a car. Apparently, it's federal government property. The tow operator fled when he realized what it was. The alarm system triggered, and now we're here. Karen reemerged from the shadow of her porch, her arms folded defensively. Officer, I have the right to enforce HOA bylaws. That's all this was, a compliance matter. I stepped forward, my phone still in hand. Officer Perez, I'm in contact with the owner of this vehicle. He's an FBI agent. This car is a federal asset. The HOA tried to tow it without legitimate grounds. We're not talking about a typical parking violation. Karen scoffed. He claims it's the FBI. I see no proof. He's stonewalling the HOA, refusing to register the car. That's a clear violation of our covenants. Perez raised an eyebrow. Okay, let's dial things back. Sir, can you produce any documentation or official statement about the car's ownership? I recalled Hector's words. I'll give you official clearance. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message from Hector, giving me permission to share his name, badge number, and direct FBI contact. I showed it to Officer Perez. He took out his own phone and stepped aside to place a call. We all stood there, the tension palpable. Neighbors had mostly retreated to a safe distance, still watching, but no longer on the front lines of the confrontation. After a few minutes, Officer Perez returned, the expression on his face telling me everything I needed to know. He cleared his throat. I just spoke with the local FBI field office. The vehicle is indeed registered to them under a special operational program. It's classified. They're sending someone to secure it within 24 hours. Karen's face went ashen. She tried to speak, but choked on her words. Finally, she managed, I didn't know. We tried to ask him to register. He refused. Officer Perez regarded her with a calm but firm stare. Ma'am, I understand you're with the HOA. However, towing a federally owned vehicle could have led to significant legal consequences. In the future, you might want to verify ownership before taking such drastic measures. The FBI does not appreciate its assets being tampered with. She looked like she wanted to protest, but Richard's presence and the circle of curious neighbors kept her silent. Perez turned to me. Given the circumstances, no charges will be filed tonight, unless the FBI chooses to pursue the matter. I suggest you cooperate fully if they require further statements. As for the HOA enforcement, that's a civil matter, but I'd advise you both to handle it through proper channels rather than calling in a tow truck. With that, the officers departed. The crowd dispersed, though I caught more than a few smug smiles shot Karen's way. She stood in the street, her bravado replaced with an almost shell-shocked expression. Before I could say a word to her, she stormed back to her house, slamming the door. The next morning, I woke to find a note in my mailbox, this time from the HOA board, not just Karen. They called for an emergency hearing regarding the disturbance caused by my unregistered vehicle. I figured this was Karen's attempt to salvage control, or at least shift the blame to me. Honestly, I was done playing games. I had recorded footage of the entire incident on my phone, plus witness statements from Richard and other neighbors. If the board wanted to push me, I'd gladly provide them with a comprehensive breakdown of how Karen nearly violated federal law. That afternoon, Hector finally arrived in person, earlier than planned. He'd wrapped up his assignment faster than expected once he heard what went down. Hector, tall and imposing in his dark suit, wasted no time. He marched over to my house, gave me a quick handshake, and asked me to show him where the car was. After inspecting it, he phoned the local FBI liaison who came with an unmarked van. They planned to take the sedan off-site to a secure location. The van pulled up, and within minutes, they had the car loaded onto a specialized carrier, far more professional than a rusted, old tow truck Karen had hired. I couldn't resist taking a peek out the window to see if Karen was watching. Sure enough, her curtains twitched, betraying her presence. She never came outside, probably too mortified to face the federal agents. Before Hector left, he asked if I wanted any sort of official follow-up. We can press charges for attempted theft of government property or interference with an operation, though that might be a stretch. Honestly, it's your call. We can let it go, or we can elevate it if she keeps causing trouble. I mulled it over. The notion of seeing Karen hauled away in cuffs was tempting, but I was also mindful of the neighborhood. We all still had to live here, though maybe Karen wouldn't remain very popular for long. Let's hold off, I decided. Unless she escalates. I just want peace. Hector nodded. Fair enough. But if anything else happens, you let me know immediately. I thanked him and watched as the FBI team left, the government sedan discreetly hidden in their transport. The ghost of this fiasco remained, but at least the immediate threat to my property and to my blood pressure was gone. A few days later, the HOA's so-called emergency hearing happened. To my mild surprise, most board members were polite, if not outright apologetic. Karen, on the other hand, attempted to pin the blame on me, claiming I'd refused to follow guidelines or produce documentation. The board listened to her rant, then asked me for my side. I calmly explained the full story, brandishing a letter from the FBI liaison that confirmed the car's official status. Karen's face turned bright crimson when one board member softly pointed out that she had risked exposing Glenwood Oaks to a potential federal investigation, something that would have cost the association and possibly homeowners a fortune in legal fees. In the end, the board essentially censured her. They removed her from her compliance chair role and barred her from enforcement actions without direct board supervision. That was the last straw for Karen. She quit the HOA entirely in a dramatic huff and posted a long, rambling message on the community forum, accusing everyone of incompetence and conspiracy. Some folks sympathized with her, but most felt relieved. No one liked living in fear of random fines or midnight towing raids. In the wake of it all, the neighborhood settled down to a dull roar, which is exactly how I like it. I still see Karen sometimes, usually scowling from behind her living room blinds. She keeps her distance. I suspect the memory of that screaming alarm and the threat of federal charges still lingers in her mind. As for me, I can't help but chuckle whenever I think about how HOA Karen tried to tow an FBI car, only to have it blow up in her face in the most spectacular way possible. Some lessons are learned the hard way, and in her case, it might just be a lesson never forgotten. So there you have it, an ordinary suburban homeowner caught in an extraordinary clash of authority, ignorance, and a dash of federal intervention. It's a story that proves no matter how mundane your world may appear, never underestimate what can happen when the wrong person tries to tangle with the FBI, especially over something as simple as a parked car.